Mabel Ruth Corrigan had spent 52 years building a life that held. Solid in the way of things made with patience and consistent attention, unremarkable by many measures but resistant to the kind of collapse that comes when foundations are built carelessly. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She came from Flat Creek, a narrow agricultural hollow 10 miles outside Hartley, Tennessee, the third daughter of a tobacco farmer named August Sutter who believed, with the settled conviction of a man who had learned it at real cost, that a woman who could manage a ledger and read a contract before signing it was better equipped for the world than most people twice her age. He taught all 4 of his daughters accordingly. Mabel absorbed the lesson so completely that it stopped feeling like a lesson and became the way she moved through the world, paying attention to what others overlooked, writing down what others trusted to memory, letting nothing of significance pass unrecorded. She earned a bookkeeping certificate from Hartley Community College in 1965, worked 4 years at a feed supply company on the edge of town where the pay did not come close to matching the skill being applied, and she knew it, and in 1969 took a position as head bookkeeper at Crane and Hadley Hardware Supply in downtown Hartley, a job that paid her what she was actually worth. She was 23 years old and accepted it with the composure of someone who had been expecting it to appear eventually, without requiring anyone to make a fuss about it. She met Harold Corrigan in the spring of 1971 at a church social hosted by the First Methodist Congregation on Elm Street, an event she attended more out of courtesy to a colleague who had asked her along than out of any expectation of a memorable evening. Harold was 28 years old and worked as a civil engineer for the Tennessee Valley Authority out of the regional office in Hartley. He was lean, deliberate in his movements, and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who spend a great deal of their time solving problems in their own heads. He stood near the refreshment table for the better part of the first hour, apparently more interested in the structural details of the church ceiling than in conversation with anyone around him. Mabel, who had been watching him from across the room with the focused attention she applied to most things that didn't immediately make sense to her, finally walked over and asked what he was looking at. He pointed upward. "The load-bearing joints on the west wall are separating," he said. "Has been happening for years by the look of it. Another decade without work done on it and that gallery presents a real liability." Then he looked at her directly for the first time and said, "I'm Harold Corrigan. I tend to notice structural problems before I notice most other things." Mabel looked up at the joints, then back at him. "My father pointed that same problem out to the deacon 3 years ago," she said. "Nothing was done." Harold smiled. It was, she would reflect many years later, the most honest smile she had ever seen on a man's face, the smile of someone who has just realized they are talking to a person who looks at the same things they look at, and had not expected to find such a person at a church social on a Tuesday evening in Tennessee. They were married in October of 1972 in a small ceremony at the same First Methodist Church, their families filling the pews on either side, and neither of them able to look at the West Wall gallery during the service without a private exchange of glances. They rented a house on Sycamore Road for 2 years while Harold saved, then in 1974 purchased a farmhouse on 14 acres on the eastern edge of Hartley, land that ran along a creek bottom and climbed the first fold of the ridge behind the house. Mabel planted a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope the first spring and kept it going for the next 30 years. Their daughter Patricia was born in 1973, a year before they bought the farmhouse, and grew up on those 14 acres with the ease of a child who has never known any other place as home. She had her father's fascination with how mechanical things worked and her mother's stubbornness, a combination that served her well in most circumstances and made her extremely difficult to argue with in all of them. Patricia married in her mid-20s, had 3 children, Derek born in 1989, Melissa in 1992, and Jared in 1996, and spent much of her adult life in the kind of difficult marriage that takes years to name honestly. When the marriage ended, she moved back to Hartley with her children for 2 years. When she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2012, she moved back again. She died in the spring of 2013. She was 40 years old. Mabel and Harold helped raise those 3 grandchildren in the years that followed, In the way that grandparents do when circumstances demand it and love makes the demand feel less like a burden than it might otherwise. Derek was 23 when his mother died, Melissa was 20, Jared was 16. Harold drove Jared to school for 2 years. Mabel cooked Sunday dinners for all 3 of them well into the following decade. She had loved them because they were Patricia's, and Patricia had been hers, and that line of love did not break simply because Patricia was gone. Harold had left the TVA in 1981 to open his own consultancy, Corrigan Technical Services, operating first from the farmhouse and then from a small downtown office. He was a careful, thorough engineer whose clients returned because he delivered what he promised and charged what it cost, nothing more. Mabel managed the company accounts alongside the household finances for the full 23 years the business ran, and when Harold wound the consultancy down as his health declined in his mid-70s, she had their shared financial life in as good an order as it had ever been. Retirement accounts, the farmhouse paid off entirely, a joint investment account built contribution by careful contribution over 3 decades. Approximately $180,000 in that account, alongside the property and Harold's TVA pension. Not a fortune. Enough, if handled correctly, for 2 people who had never required more than enough. In 1979, Harold had purchased a warehouse. It was a single-story brick building on Foundry Lane, behind Hartley's old rail yard, approximately 4,000 square feet with high ceilings, thick walls, and a loading dock that had not been operational since the building's previous occupant, a farm equipment supplier, had gone out of business in 1971. Harold paid for it what most people would have paid for a reliable used truck, and told Mabel he intended to use it as an engineering workshop. This was true, as far as it went. It was not the whole truth. Harold Corrigan had been, since his early 20s, systematically building a collection of antique mechanical timepieces. Clocks, primarily. Precision instruments. Mechanical automata, clockwork figures crafted by European artisans in the 18th and 19th centuries as demonstrations of engineering knowledge that verged on the extraordinary. Auroras. Astronomical regulators with multiple synchronized dials. Self-playing mechanical organs small enough to fit in a cabinet and technically precise enough to have made their original makers famous across 3 countries. He had started with a single purchase at an estate sale in Knoxville in 1968, a French carriage clock from approximately 1880 that he bought for $30 because the seller did not recognize what it was, and Harold, who had spent 3 years reading privately about antique horology without mentioning this to anyone, did. He had it serviced in Nashville by a specialist whose name he had tracked down through careful correspondence, placed the clock on his desk, and watched it keep perfect time for the rest of his life. By 1979, when he bought the warehouse, he had accumulated 60 or 70 pieces, stored in a locked room at the farmhouse and catalogued in a series of notebooks with the systematic thoroughness of a man trained to document everything. The warehouse gave him room to do what he had always been doing but had never had adequate space to do properly. He installed climate-controlled shelving along all 4 interior walls. He added humidity monitoring in 1983 and a security system in 1987. He spent 2 or 3 evenings each week in that building for the better part of 30 years, acquiring pieces through auction houses and estate sales and an extensive correspondence with fellow collectors in Europe and North America, cataloging each acquisition with photographs, provenance records, and written condition assessments, restoring what needed restoration with the patience of an engineer who understood that precise work was not something you hurried. Mabel had visited the warehouse perhaps 12 times in 30 years. Harold never concealed its existence. He simply did not burden her with the particulars of something that was, in his view, primarily his own domain, a private life, contained entirely within those warehouse walls, separate from everything else they shared but never hidden from it. What she knew, the building held his collection. The collection was worth considerably more than it had cost him. Harold maintained it with the same meticulous care he brought to every engineering project he had ever undertaken. She accepted this without needing to fully understand its dimensions, in the way that long marriages accommodate the territories that belong entirely to one person and resist complete translation into shared language. In 1981, Harold transferred the warehouse deed into Mabel's name alone. He had done this following a dispute with a former business partner that made him cautious about assets held under his own name during a period of legal uncertainty. The matter resolved, but he never transferred the deed back. The warehouse remained legally hers, recorded in her name in the county deed records, while Harold continued to use the space as before. This was a detail so practical and so unremarkable at the time that neither of them thought about it very often in the years that followed. It would turn out to be the most consequential practical decision Harold Corrigan ever made. His first stroke came in the autumn 2 years before his death, arriving with the specific abruptness that strokes produce. One morning ordinary, the following morning changed in ways that could not be fully reversed. He recovered enough to continue working a reduced schedule and to manage his own affairs during the hours when he was sharpest. He was not the same afterward, and both of them knew this without requiring it to be said aloud. His second stroke, 18 months later, was larger than the first and offered no room for recovery. He died in March, 2 years ago. He was 79 years old, and they had been married for 52 of them. 3 weeks before he died, on a clear February morning when he was still lucid and still able to direct what needed directing, Harold asked Mabel to drive him to the warehouse. She drove him at the speed his comfort required, which was slow, and waited on the sidewalk while he navigated the uneven curb with his cane, watching him until he was inside the door. He was in the building for 45 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying a stack of 9 notebooks, the full collection of ledgers from the warehouse, every record he had kept over 4 decades. He placed them carefully on the back seat of the car. He locked the warehouse himself, working through each padlock in turn with a thoroughness that told Mabel he had thought about this moment well in advance. 3 locks on the main doors, 1 on a side entrance she had not noticed before. When he was finished, he took the warehouse keys off his own ring and placed them on a smaller ring by themselves. He pressed that ring into Mabel's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Everything in there is yours," he said. "When you're ready. Don't let anyone rush you." She had not known what to say. She nodded. He did not explain further, and they drove home in the particular silence of people who have understood each other completely and do not require elaboration. He died 11 days later. The first year of widowhood was the longest of Mabel's life. She had understood intellectually that grief occupied the body as much as the mind. She had not understood, until she was inside it, that it would locate itself so specifically in the ordinary hours, the 4 to 6 o'clock stretch each afternoon when Harold had always come in from wherever he had been and put the kettle on. She reorganized those hours around the garden, around the company accounts she still managed as a courtesy to the engineers who had taken over Harold's consultancy, and around the slow, careful work of sorting through 52 years of accumulated life in a 14-room farmhouse. She did not go to the warehouse that first year. Harold had said, "When you're ready." She kept the key ring in the drawer of her bedside table and thought about it occasionally in the early hours, lying awake, and told herself she would go when the time was right. She was not ready yet. What arrived instead, in the 8th month after Harold's death, was Derek. He came on a Saturday in November, Melissa beside him, Jared a step behind. They brought wine and a casserole that no one had clearly cooked and said Mabel looked well but too thin. Derek moved through the farmhouse with the contained attentiveness of someone conducting an assessment he had already completed mentally before arriving, asking about the heating system, noting the maintenance the back porch needed, expressing concern, repeatedly, about a 76-year-old woman managing 14 acres alone. His concern sounded genuine. Mabel accepted it as such, because she had loved Patricia, and Patricia had loved these children, and she had not yet learned to weigh Derek's concern against anything else on the scale. By the end of the 3rd hour in her kitchen, Derek had presented the proposal. A family trust. The farmhouse and land would be held by the trust as assets. Her savings, approximately $180,000 from Harold's estate, would be consolidated into a managed account within it. Derek and Melissa would serve as trustees, handling all property maintenance and financial management. Mabel would receive $1,200 each month. When she could no longer live independently, the trust would fund her care. The assets would pass to the family in due course. She would not have to worry about any of it. Jared said almost nothing throughout. He sat at Mabel's kitchen table and looked at his hands, and his silence was the one detail Mabel found she could not quite account for and eventually set aside. She would come back to it later. Derek left the name and number of the attorney who had drafted the trust documents and suggested Mabel call him with any questions she might have. He did not suggest she consult her own attorney. Mabel asked for a week to think it over. Derek said of course, naturally, take all the time she needed, and left with Melissa, and the kitchen was very still after they had gone. She thought about it for a week. She had no one to help her think it through properly. Her closest friend in Hartley, Edna Pross, had moved to her daughter's home in Chattanooga the previous spring. Calvin Breck, her attorney, was semi-retired and she felt reluctant to trouble him. She read the trust documents twice, slowly, and understood most of the language, and told herself that what she did not fully understand was likely standard legal construction. She trusted her grandchildren. She was 76 years old and she was tired in a way she had not let herself fully acknowledge, and the farmhouse was very large for one person now. She signed in December, at a law office in Nashville she had never visited before, using a pen the notary handed her, beside a stack of documents she had reviewed enough times to feel familiar with, which was not the same thing as understanding them fully, though it was close enough to feel like it at the time. The farmhouse sold 8 months later. Mabel learned this not from Derek or Melissa but from Edna Pross, who heard it from her sister in Hartley, who had seen the sale sign go up on the road frontage. Derek confirmed the sale that afternoon when Mabel called. The trust's financial modeling had determined that selling was the most responsible course for the long-term security of the fund. The proceeds had been reinvested within the trust. Her monthly disbursement remained unchanged. She should not worry. She had moved to the apartment on Maple Street the previous February, a one-bedroom unit above a dry cleaning shop with a kitchen window that faced the parking lot and a bathroom faucet that dripped at intervals too irregular to ignore and too infrequent to justify the cost of a plumber on her current allowance. She had furnished it with what she had been permitted to take from the farmhouse. Harold's 9 ledgers were stacked on the bedroom shelf in the exact order he had placed them on the car's back seat. His photograph from their 40th anniversary, taken on the farmhouse porch, hung on the living room wall beside the window. She still had the key ring. She had moved it from the bedside drawer to the pocket of Harold's old winter coat in the first numb weeks after the funeral, without particular intention, and then hung the coat in the bedroom closet and not thought about it again. She found it in November, on a morning when the temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and she went to the closet for the coat. She put her hands in the pockets out of habit, the way you check a coat for anything left in it before wearing it, and her fingers closed on 3 keys on a small metal ring. She stood in the cold bedroom with Harold's coat half on and the key ring in her palm and looked at it for a long time. She was 78 years old. The farmhouse was gone. The land was gone. The savings Harold had spent a lifetime building were held in a trust controlled by people who had presented the arrangement as care and had delivered something considerably different from care. Calvin Breck, when she had finally called him after the farmhouse sale, had reviewed the documents and told her in the careful voice of a man delivering unwelcome news that the transfer had been legal. She had signed. The documents were properly drawn. Her options for challenge were narrow, expensive, and uncertain. What she had, beyond the coat and the photograph and the 9 ledgers lined up on the shelf, was the warehouse on Foundry Lane. Listed in her name in the county deed records, exactly as Harold had arranged it in 1981 and never once changed. She pulled the coat on the rest of the way, picked up her car keys from the kitchen counter, and drove to Foundry Lane through the frost-thin morning streets of Hartley. The building looked smaller than she remembered and larger than she had let herself imagine. Single-story brick, the bricks dark with age and the mortar lines wide and worn in the way of old construction that has fully settled into its foundations. High industrial windows along the north wall, most of them intact. The loading dock at the east end, hinged up and latched. The main entrance at the west end, 2 wide steel doors, the green paint lifting at the corners and rust visible beneath, and 3 padlocks, each one large and solid and, she could see from 15 feet away, well maintained. Harold had come here after his health declined. She remembered now, she had driven him one cold afternoon 2 winters before his stroke, and waited in the car while he went around the building with a small oil can and his cane, attending to the locks, the hinges, whatever required attention. She had thought at the time it was the stubbornness of an old man unwilling to let go of something he could no longer fully use. She understood it differently now. It had been preparation, carried out with the thoroughness he had brought to everything that mattered. She found the first key on the ring. It fit the first padlock cleanly and turned without effort. The second key opened the second lock with the same ease. The third key, slightly heavier than the others, opened the third lock in a single smooth rotation, as though it had been oiled last week. The padlocks came free. The chain through the door handles fell slack. Mabel put her hand on the right-hand door and pushed. The door moved inward on hinges that did not protest. Did not announce themselves with rust or resistance. They moved with the precision of mechanisms that had been maintained for exactly this moment, for when someone needed them to open, so they would open. The air from inside the building came out cool and dry and entirely still. And in it, she heard something she had not expected. Not silence. The opposite of silence. Dozens of individual sounds, each one small and precise, layered over each other in the dark interior of the building, adding up to something she stood and listened to for a long moment before her mind gave it a name. Ticking. From every part of the warehouse, ticking. At different rhythms, different registers, different intervals. The sound of mechanisms wound and set and left to run, and still running. All of them, after 2 years without Harold, still running. Mabel stood in the open doorway of her husband's warehouse and did not move. She let her eyes adjust to the dark and listened to his collection measuring the seconds of a November morning in Hartley with the patience of things built to outlast the people who made them. She did not cry. She breathed, and she waited, and when she finally stepped across the threshold, she did it the way she had always done the things that mattered, one foot in front of the other, attending to what was directly in front of her, and moving forward. The dark inside the warehouse was not absolute. Light filtered through the high industrial windows on the north wall in thin horizontal bars, and in each bar dust moved with the slow patience of air that had not been disturbed for a very long time. Mabel stood just inside the doorway and let her eyes adjust, the ticking surrounding her from all directions, each mechanism marking its own separate interval, and the combined effect of all of them together was something she could feel in her chest as much as here. A layered, ordered pulse in the cool air of the building. She had a small flashlight from the Buick's glove compartment. She swept it left, then right, and the beam caught the edge of a shelf and the corner of something on it, dark wood, brass fittings, the curved shoulder of a clock case, and then swept further and caught another piece, and another, row upon row of them receding into the warehouse's interior. The shelving extended to the ceiling on every wall she could see. She had significantly underestimated what she was stepping into. She found Harold's work light 12 feet from the entrance, mounted on a heavy adjustable arm bolted to a steel pole beside a long workbench that ran the full length of the south wall. The switch was a simple toggle at shoulder height on the pole. She pressed it. The light came on without hesitation, a warm, wide circle that spread across the workbench and pushed the dark back toward the walls where it thinned without fully disappearing. By that light, Mabel Corrigan saw her husband's life's work for the first time. The shelving ran floor to ceiling on all 4 walls, constructed from dense dark timber in the way Harold had always built things, over-engineered for durability, slightly more substantial than the load it carried strictly required, made to last considerably longer than anyone expected to need it. Each shelf held pieces arranged on padded wooden stands, spaced so that nothing touched anything else, and each piece had adequate clearance on all sides. Between every 2 pieces stood a small ivory-colored card in a brass holder, handwritten in Harold's small, precise script. Reference number, maker, country of origin, approximate date, acquisition source, and date. The same documentation she had seen in his ledgers, applied here with a consistency she had not anticipated. Every single piece labeled. Every single one. She walked the perimeter of the warehouse slowly, reading the cards as she went. The north wall held what appeared to be the chronological foundation of the collection, English bracket and mantel clocks spanning from the early 18th century to the late 19th. Their cases ranged from dark ebonized wood trimmed with brass fittings to tortoiseshell with silver inlay, from plain architectural forms to elaborately carved Gothic canopies. Near the center of that wall, one card read, English long case clock, Thomas Tompion, London, circa 1697. The clock itself was approximately 6 feet tall in a walnut case with a brass finial at the crown and a pendulum visible through a glass panel in the door, a broad brass disc swinging with a steady authority she could feel in the floor underfoot. She stopped in front of it for a long moment. Thomas Tompion. She knew the name in the way you know a name mentioned across many years with a significance that was never fully explained. Harold had told her once, early in their marriage, that a Tompion was to English clockmaking what a Stradivarius was to violin-making, that the man had been buried in Westminster Abbey, that there were fewer than 600 surviving examples of his work and that the best of them were in the permanent collections of the British Museum and the Science Museum in London. She had nodded and not asked for more. She wished she had asked for more. She kept walking. The east wall held smaller pieces in greater density. Carriage clocks in gilt bronze cases with enamel panels. Pocket watches arranged in custom-fitted display cases, each watch in its own compartment behind glass. A traveling clock in an engine-turned gold case with a fold-flat design that the card identified as Swiss, maker attributed, c. 1855, acquired Vienna 2001. A group of 4 French Empire mantel clocks with matching candelabra in dark marble and gilt bronze, the cards noting they had been acquired together from a Paris estate sale in 1994 and were almost certainly made for a single original commission. Then, near the end of the east wall, the card she stopped in front of read, Imperial Court Clock, Canton Workshops, Qing Dynasty circa 1785 to 1800. Commissioned for presentation to the Qianlong Emperor. Provenance, Private European Collection, sold Brussels 2003, acquired by correspondence. Original mechanism intact. Ref. IMP 011. The piece was a pavilion-shaped clock in gilt bronze and cloisonné enamel, approximately 3 feet tall, with a miniature figure of a court official at its apex. The colors in the enamel panels were extraordinary even in the oblique light of the warehouse windows: imperial yellow, jade green, cinnabar red, applied in the traditional manner that Chinese imperial workshops had used for centuries. She knew from nothing more than common sense that a clock commissioned for an emperor in the 18th century, with full provenance and original mechanism, did not have a modest value. She did not try to estimate. She simply looked at it, and moved on. The south wall was where Harold had put the pieces that required more explanation. The cards here were longer, the notes more detailed, the provenance descriptions extended onto small additional cards attached at the back. She understood as she read them that these were the objects Harold had found most significant, the ones with the histories that mattered as much as the objects themselves. She stopped in front of the piece on the middle shelf of the south wall's central section and stood looking at it for some time. It was a seated figure, approximately 18 inches tall, made from carved ivory and gilt bronze. The figure was a young man in period dress, seated at a writing desk, his right hand holding a miniature pen resting on a small sheet of paper attached to the desk surface. His face was painted with an expressiveness that was unsettling and remarkable at the same time, the concentration of someone engaged in an act requiring complete attention. The card in front of him read, Writing Automaton. Geneva Workshop, attributed to Maillard at School, c. 1808 to 1812, acquired private estate, Lausanne, Switzerland, 1996, via agent correspondence. Complete original mechanism, 6,400 individual cams. Capable of inscribing 3 texts in 2 languages. Mechanism intact and operational. Last demonstrated October 2019. Ref. AUT001. She read the card twice. Then she looked at the figure's poised hand and thought about what it meant for an object made from metal and ivory in 1810 to be capable of writing. To contain, within its bronze interior, the precise sequence of instructions required to form letters and words in two different languages, not as a pattern, not as a copy, but as an original act of inscription, performed by a mechanism that had no mind and no intention and no knowledge of what it was doing, and yet, when set in motion, did it anyway. She understood, standing in front of that figure, what Harold had spent 40 years looking for. She understood it for the first time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She had nearly completed her circuit of the warehouse walls when she noticed the northwest corner. The shelving there terminated approximately 3 feet short of the corner wall itself, leaving a gap she had initially taken for a maintenance access corridor. But standing at the end of the south wall's shelving and looking across the warehouse at it directly, she saw that what she had taken for the brick exterior of the building in that corner was not the brick exterior. It was a different wall. Smooth-faced, poured concrete, with a steel frame set into it. She moved around the end of the shelving unit and into the gap. It was a vault door. A full-sized vault door, not a safe, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, with a circular combination lock centered in the faceplate and a handle below it. The steel was painted matte gray and showed no rust, no weathering, none of the surface deterioration that touched everything on the building's exterior. Someone had maintained this door. The same person who had maintained the entrance padlocks. The same person who had built every other thing in this building to outlast the time allotted to it. She put her hand flat on the door face. The steel was cold and entirely solid. It did not flex. It did not yield. This was a purpose-built containment room, installed inside a brick warehouse behind a section of shelving arranged so that a person walking the perimeter of the main collection would see shelving and assume they had seen the whole room. You would have to look at the northwest corner from the far end of the south wall, at the right angle, to notice the gap at all. Harold had built a vault inside his warehouse. And he had built it in a spot where only someone walking the perimeter carefully, reading every card, paying attention to the details that did not immediately make sense, would find it. She did not have the combination. She checked the door face, the frame, the concrete on either side, and found nothing written or affixed. The combination was somewhere else. She had been meant to find it somewhere else. She went back to Harold's workbench. The bench was long and solid, the surface carrying the organized accumulation of an active workspace interrupted mid-task and not resumed. A small bracket clock sat at the center of the bench under the work light, its back panel removed and its movement exposed a landscape of miniature wheels and springs and levers laid open to examination with the magnifying lens on its swing arm position over it, exactly as Harold had left it. The tool roll beside it, a leather case containing watchmaker's tools arranged precisely by size, lay open and ready for use. Everything in its place. Everything waiting. She looked at the exposed clock movement under the lens for a moment, at the complexity of what it took to make a small object mark the passage of time accurately, and then she looked at the papers on the clipboard hanging on the wall hook above the bench. She lifted the clipboard down. 3 documents. The first was a handwritten inventory list of 23 items, each described in Harold's standard notation and each carrying a reference number with the prefix VV001 through V023. A vault inventory. Separate from the main shelving references she had been reading. 23 additional pieces, held inside the concrete-walled room in the northwest corner, unaccounted for in everything she had seen on the walls. The second document was a typed sheet on letterhead from a firm called Meridian Horological Consulting, New York, dated March 2019. She read the first paragraph, and then she read the second, and then she set the clipboard on the bench and stood very still for a moment before picking it up again. The appraisal covered 112 pieces from the main warehouse, shelving the pieces she had just spent an hour walking past. The consulting firm's conservative estimate, accounting for current market conditions and projected institutional interest, placed the combined value of those 112 pieces at between $4. 1 million and $6. 3 million. The upper figure assumed competitive bidding from multiple institutional buyers at a major international auction. The lower assumed a negotiated private sale. She held the figure in her mind with the practiced steadiness of a woman who had managed significant numbers her entire life and understood that a large number, in the moment of first encounter, required the same careful attention as any other number before you allowed yourself to draw conclusions from it. $4 to $6 million. On the shelves. In the open. And the vault held 23 additional pieces that the 2019 appraisal had not covered, because the appraiser had not known they existed. The third document on the clipboard was an envelope. White, standard size, sealed. Her name in Harold's handwriting on the front. Not Mrs. Corrigan. Not Mabel Ruth Corrigan. Simply, Mabel. She took it from the clipboard and sat down on Harold's workbench stool. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was 4 pages on ivory notepaper, written in his habitual small and exact hand, the date at the top February 14, 2 years ago. He had come to the warehouse alone at some point in those last weeks before he asked her to drive him here, sat at this bench, and written this. He had been planning this for some time before he wrote it. He opened with the practical information, in the manner of a man who understood that well-organized practical information was its own form of care and needed no additional explanation to be received as such. He wrote about the deed, already in her name since 1981. He had verified its standing with Calvin Breck in 2018 and Calvin had confirmed the transfer was unambiguous, properly recorded, and would survive any legal challenge without difficulty. He wrote that she should understand this clearly: the warehouse, and everything inside it, was hers by straightforward property law, with 4 decades of clean county deed records to support it. He wrote about the 2019 appraisal. He had commissioned Meridian Horological Consulting specifically because they were unknown to anyone in his personal or professional circles and he wanted the appraisal kept private. The $4. $1 to $6. $3 million estimate covered the main collection only. He had told the appraiser nothing about the vault. He wrote about the vault. He had been acquiring the 23 vault pieces separately, across the final decade of his collecting, specifically because he had found them through channels where their significance had not been fully recognized. He wrote that he believed several of the vault pieces were among the most important objects in the collection and possibly the most important objects he had ever found, but that he had not had them formally assessed because he wanted their existence to remain private until the right moment and the right person. He wrote that the vault combination was 47-10-72, and then he wrote it again, and he explained his birth year, the month of their wedding, the year of their wedding. He wrote that he had chosen it because she would always be able to reconstruct it from memory even if the written record were lost. She paused on that. She set the pages down for a moment and looked at the clock movement Harold had been working on under the magnifying lens, and she thought about a man who had chosen a combination lock code specifically so that his wife could always reconstruct it from the 3 numbers she would never be able to forget. She thought about all the forms that care can take, and how most of them go unnamed. She picked the letter back up. He wrote about Derek. He had understood for several years what Derek was likely to attempt once Harold was gone. He described it the way Harold described most things, accurately, without drama, with the specific detail that distinguished observation from assumption. He had watched how Derek talked about the farmhouse, how he asked about the investment accounts during visits, how he managed conversations about Mabel's well-being in the way of someone building a case rather than expressing concern. He wrote that he had done what he could. The deed in her name. The collection documented with a thoroughness that made its value impossible to dismiss if anyone bothered to look. The vault holding the most significant pieces behind a door that required both physical access and specific knowledge to open. He had hoped it would not be necessary. He had prepared as though it certainly would be. He wrote that he was sorry he had not found a way to tell her all of this directly, and sooner. He had always believed the right time was approaching. He had kept deferring it, the way people defer the conversations that matter most because the fact of their necessity feels, in the ordinary run of good days, like an admission of something they would rather not admit. He had finally understood, in those last months, that there was no right time coming. There was the letter, and the vault combination, and one name. The name was Dr. Annette Howell. Harold had corresponded with her for 11 years. She was a professor of material culture at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., specializing in the history of mechanical timekeeping. She knew Harold's collection existed. She had seen photographs of more than 40 of the main shelving pieces. 3 years before his death, she had written to him that when he was ready to discuss the collection's future, the Smithsonian wished to be part of that conversation. Her letter was in the vault. In a folder labeled H. Harold wrote that he trusted Dr. Howell's judgment above anyone else he had encountered in 40 years of working in this field, because she cared about the objects and their histories as much as she cared about their monetary significance, and this made her the right person to call first. He provided her direct telephone number at the Smithsonian. He wrote it twice, as he had written the vault combination twice, because this was how Harold Corrigan handled information of importance. He provided it, and then he provided it again. Then on the 4th page, the last page, the spacing of his handwriting changed. The letters were the same size and precision, but more deliberate, wider between each word, as though he had set them down one at a time rather than in the flowing run of the preceding pages. He wrote, "I have spent a great deal of my life paying attention to things that did not move and did not speak, and finding in them a complexity that seemed to justify the attention. I understand now, more clearly than I have at any previous point, that I did not pay sufficient attention to the things that did move and speak to you, to what it cost you to do what you did, and to the considerable gap between understanding something and saying it plainly. You built our life. I do not mean this in the vague, general way the phrase is sometimes used. I mean it structurally, in the engineering sense that I understand best. You were the load-bearing element of everything we made together, and I knew this, and I let the knowledge sit in me for 50 years without putting it in adequate terms. Everything in that building is yours in the legal sense, as I have explained above. I mean it in a different sense as well. You earned it. Not by being my wife, not by enduring anything, but by showing up every day for 5 decades and doing the work that made everything else possible. That is what the building holds. That is what it has been holding. The ticking you hear when you open the door, those mechanisms run because someone wound them and set them and maintained the conditions required to keep them running. That is what they have always needed. That is what you have always understood how to provide." She folded the letter along its original creases, placed it back in the envelope, and sat with it in both hands on Harold's workbench stool, in the warm circle of his work light, listening to the collection keep time around her in the warehouse dark. She sat there for a while. She did not count the minutes. The mechanisms counted them for her. Then she stood, tucked the envelope into Harold's coat pocket alongside the key ring, and picked up the clipboard with its vault inventory and the meridian appraisal. She walked to the northwest corner, into the gap behind the shelving unit, and stood in front of the vault door. The combination dial was solid steel, the numbers precise and clear. She turned it to the right, 47. She turned it back to the left, 10. She turned it to the right again, 72. She felt the tumblers align before she heard them, a specific settling in the mechanism that transmitted through the dial and into her palm, unmistakable, the sensation of things moving into positions they had been waiting to occupy. She pressed the handle down and pulled. The door swung outward on a counterbalanced hinge, moving with a smoothness that had no right to belong to something this heavy, the kind of smoothness that only exceptional original engineering produces. The air inside the vault was drier than the main warehouse, colder by several degrees, and the dark inside was complete. She swept the flashlight beam across the shelving on the 3 interior walls. The pieces were different in character from those outside. Varied in form, more striking in proportion, some considerably larger than anything on the main shelving, a few extraordinarily small. She could see at a glance, even by flashlight, that the cards in front of these pieces were longer than any she had read in the main collection. More text. More history. More to explain. She moved the flashlight beam slowly across one shelf, then the next. She read the visible portions of 3 cards and stopped at the 3rd. She needed better light. She needed Dr. Annette Howell. She understood with the focused clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life attending to what the numbers in front of her actually said, considerably more than what she currently had the resources to provide for herself on $1,200 a month. She turned off the flashlight. She let the vault door swing closed behind her and pressed the handle until she heard the mechanism seat. She walked back through the main warehouse, past the ticking shelves, past the writing automaton with his pen poised over the paper in the dark, past the Tompion clock marking seconds that it had been marking since the reign of King William III, past Harold's workbench and the small clock still waiting under the magnifying lens. She pressed the work light switch. The darkness came back fully. The ticking remained. She stepped back through the main entrance into the November morning. She pulled the steel doors shut. She threaded the chain back through the handles and pressed each padlock closed in turn. She tested all three. They held. She walked to the Buick and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting it. Foundry Lane was empty in both directions. The rail yard beyond the fence was still and gray and cold. A crow moved along the top of the fence line and stopped and looked at nothing in particular and moved on. She drove back to the apartment on Maple Street and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with Harold's ninth ledger open in front of her. The ledger was the most recent of the 9, covering his acquisitions from 2014 through 2020, and it was the only one she had not yet read in full in the 2 years since she had brought the stack home from the warehouse. She had reading to do before she made the call to Washington. She began at the first page of the ninth ledger and read forward, taking her time with each entry, cross-referencing the vault inventory list from the clipboard when she reached items that bore V-Series reference numbers. There were 9 V-Series entries in the ninth ledger, each described in the same careful notation Harold used for all his acquisitions, but with a detail and care in the condition notes that exceeded anything she had seen in the earlier ledgers. He had been writing these entries with the awareness that someone would eventually need to understand them without him present to explain. She read for 4 hours without stopping. By the time she closed the ledger and set it beside the others on the bedroom shelf, the afternoon light had dropped below the apartment buildings across the street and the kitchen window was dark. She stood at the window for a moment with her tea, which had long gone cold, and looked at the parking lot below and thought about what Harold had known and what he had built and what he had chosen not to sell and why. He had wanted the collection to go somewhere it would be cared for properly. He had wanted the circumstances of its transfer to be right, not a fire sale, not a distress situation, not a family dispute over an estate where the objects would be treated as assets to be liquidated rather than as things with histories worth preserving. He had been waiting for a moment when the collection could go forward on its own terms, with full documentation and proper valuation and a buyer who understood what they were receiving. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to spend 40 years building something with that kind of patience, and what it meant to trust the right moment to arrive. Then she went to her coat, Harold's coat, and took out the piece of notepaper from the clipboard pocket where she had placed it. A direct telephone number for Dr. Annette Howell at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Written twice, in Harold's hand. She looked at the number for a moment. She looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, which told her it was 4:47 in the afternoon. Washington was in the same time zone. The Smithsonian's offices would be open for another hour or so. She picked up her telephone. Dr. Annette Howell answered on the third ring. Her voice was measured and unhurried, with the specific flatness of vowels that comes from decades of academic conference rooms. She said her name and her department and waited. "This is Mabel Corrigan," Mabel said. "Harold Corrigan's wife." The pause that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then Dr. Howell's voice changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to someone not listening carefully, but Mabel had always listened carefully. "Mrs. Corrigan," Dr. Howell said. "I've been hoping you would call." They spoke for 22 minutes. Mabel told her what she had found, in the order she had found it, without editorial comment or emotional embellishment. The warehouse on Foundry Lane. The main collection on open shelving. The vault in the northwest corner. Harold's letter. The 2019 Meridian appraisal. The vault inventory of 23 additional pieces she had not yet been able to examine in full. Dr. Howell asked questions with the compact precision of someone who already understood the general territory and needed only the specific coordinates. She asked about the condition of the main pieces, about the climate control system, about Harold's provenance documentation. Mabel answered each question in turn, drawing from what she had read in the 9th ledger across the preceding 4 hours. When they had covered the essential ground, Dr. Howell said she needed to see the collection in person before saying anything with accuracy, and she asked whether Thursday would be too soon. Thursday was 2 days away. Thursday is fine, Mabel said. Dr. Howell drove herself to Hartley in a dark green Volvo that had seen considerable use and arrived at Foundry Lane at 8:45 on Thursday morning, 15 minutes before the agreed time. She was 57, compact and practical, with reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair and a bag over one shoulder that appeared to contain more equipment than its size suggested. She shook Mabel's hand with the directness of someone who had decided long ago that formality was a use of time she could not justify. She looked at the warehouse building for a moment with the expression of someone conducting a rapid structural assessment, and she said, "Harold's photographs did not do this building justice." She had brought 2 colleagues. Dr. Patterson from the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, whose focus was mechanical automata and early scientific instruments, and a conservator named Claire Sands who worked independently and had, according to Dr. Howell, handled more significant horology restorations in the past decade than anyone else currently working in North America. The 3 of them walked the main shelving for 2.5 hours while Mabel unlocked the warehouse, sat at the far end of Harold's workbench with all 9 ledgers in a canvas bag, and let the specialists work. She caught fragments of their conversation as they moved along the walls. English, probable Tompion, the escapement is original. The imperial piece, do you see the quality on the enamel panels? The writing automaton reference number, AUT001, do we have the mechanism notes? She read through the earlier ledgers and she listened, and she understood from the register of their voices what the collection was doing to people who knew what they were looking at. At 11:30, she unlocked the vault. She dialed the combination, 47 10 72, and pressed the handle and pulled the door open, and stepped aside. Dr. Howell turned on the portable LED panel she had brought in her bag and flooded the vault's interior with clean white light. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Claire Sands made a sound that was not a word. Dr. Patterson said, in a tone drained of any professional effect, that he needed a moment. Dr. Howell turned to Mabel. She said, "Mrs. Corrigan, I want to ask you something before we go further." "How much? Do you know about what your husband was acquiring in the final decade of his life?" Mabel told her what she had read in the 9th ledger. The V-series entries, Harold's acquisition notes, the provenance descriptions he had written with the deliberate care of a man who understood that someone would eventually need to read them without him present to explain. Dr. Howell nodded. She looked back into the vault for a moment, then back at Mabel directly. "He found things," she said, "that people in this field have been searching for a very long time. I want to be precise with you, because I think you deserve precision. What is in this room is not simply valuable in the monetary sense. Several of these objects are of genuine historical and scientific importance beyond their market worth. The kind of objects that belong in permanent institutional collections and should never again be held privately, not because of any law, but because of what they are and what they represent in the history of human ingenuity." "Then tell me what they are," Mabel said. They spent 3 days in the warehouse. The most significant piece occupied the center of the vault's back wall on a stand considerably more substantial than any of the others, a precision astronomical regulator in an ebonized pear wood and glass case, approximately 5 feet tall, with a seconds beating pendulum and a dial arrangement of extraordinary complexity. Dr. Howell identified it on the morning of the 2nd day after examining the movement through the opened back panel, and when she looked up from the magnifying lens and set it down, she said without any particular inflection that this was the Württemberg Regulator. The clock had been built in 1764 by a German maker named Philipp Matthias Hahn for the court of the Duke of Württemberg, one of the most precise astronomical instruments of the 18th century and widely regarded among the finest examples of German clockmaking ever produced. It had passed through several European collections across the 19th century and was last publicly documented in an 1891 auction catalogue, after which it vanished from the historical record entirely. Specialists had been searching for it, with the steady patience of people who believe a thing still exists somewhere and simply has not yet surfaced, for more than 100 years. Harold had found it at an estate sale in Zurich in 2011, the estate of a Swiss industrialist whose family had held it privately since the early 20th century without recognizing what it was. He had paid what the estate expected for an interesting antique clock of uncertain origin. He had spent 4 years verifying the provenance through original court records of the Württemberg duchy before he was satisfied that what he had was what he believed. He had told no one. Mabel thought about that for a long moment. For years of private research, conducted with the patience of a retired engineer in his late 70s who had always understood that the most important work was almost always invisible to the people around it. By the end of the third day, Dr. Howell sat down at Harold's workbench with Mabel and her 2 colleagues and spoke with the precision she had promised. The main collection on open shelving, she said, required a formal reappraisal given the 4 years since the Meridian assessment and the appreciation in the market for significant horology during that period. Her preliminary estimate placed the revised value between $5. 2 million and $7. 8 million. The vault pieces, excluding the Württemberg Regulator, she estimated at between $9 million and $14 million, with 3 specific pieces for which she was already aware of institutional interest that could drive competitive bidding. The Württemberg Regulator would require a separate assessment involving German museum authorities, provenance specialists, and the major international auction houses. Her experience suggested a range of $8 to $12 million at auction, with the realistic possibility of significantly exceeding that figure if multiple institutional buyers competed seriously. She looked at Mabel directly. A conservative aggregate of what we have assessed here over 3 days, she said, falls between $22 and $30 million. That is a preliminary estimate, not a formal appraisal, and I want you to hold it as a range until the formal process is complete. But I want you to understand the scale of what you have. Mabel held the range the way she had always held large numbers, with attention, without euphoria, with the understanding that a number of that size carried an equivalent weight of responsibility and required the same careful management as any other number she had ever worked with, except considerably more of it. She said, "I'd like to discuss what happens to the collection." They talked for 2 more hours. What Mabel had in mind was not a rapid liquidation. She had read Harold's letter carefully enough to understand what he had wanted, and she had spent the past 3 days in the warehouse understanding it more fully. The pieces of genuine historical importance, the Württemberg Regulator, the writing automaton, the Tompion clock, the imperial court clock, should go to institutions that would conserve them properly and display them with the context their histories required. She proposed a long-term loan arrangement with the Smithsonian for those pieces, with the condition that Harold's name be formally and permanently attached to the collection. Dr. Howell did not attempt to conceal that this was precisely what she had hoped to hear. The remaining pieces would be sold through the major auction houses in a managed process. The proceeds would fund an endowment for mechanical arts preservation, grants for independent conservators, researchers, and institutional collections lacking dedicated restoration resources. Mabel had worked out the broad structure in her head over the 3 days of the assessment, using the approach she had applied to every financial question she had ever faced. Identify what needs to happen, establish the mechanism, set the parameters, proceed. Dr. Howell's contacts in Washington connected Mabel with a specialist in arts and estate law named Francis Alderton, who reviewed the warehouse deed within 48 hours and confirmed in writing what Mabel had already known. The deed was clean, unambiguous, continuously recorded in her name since 1981, and subject to no claim arising from the family trust Derek had constructed. The trust documents Derek's own attorney had prepared listed the covered assets individually by name and description. The warehouse appeared on no such list because Derek and Melissa had not discovered its existence during their review of Harold's estate. The failure to investigate was theirs. There was no legal mechanism by which they could insert themselves into what Harold had built and left for her. The news traveled through Hartley the way news travels in small towns, faster than any official announcement and with a completeness that no official announcement could have matched. The first indication that something significant was happening on Foundry Lane was the Smithsonian transport van that appeared on a Tuesday morning in December, white and unmarked, with 2 transit specialist technicians who spent the better part of the day inside the warehouse. The van had Washington, D.C. registration. Someone photographed it and the photograph moved through the community's communication channels in the manner of information that people recognize as significant before they fully know why. By the following week, the essential facts were known in Hartley with sufficient accuracy that Frances Alderton recommended a brief statement through her office. The statement confirmed that Mrs. Corrigan had discovered a significant collection of antique horological instruments in a warehouse she owned in Hartley, and that the collection was being assessed for institutional disposition. It said nothing about dollar figures. It said nothing about Derek or Melissa. It said only what was strictly necessary. Derek called on a Thursday. Mabel looked at his name on her phone and set the phone on the kitchen table and let it ring. His attorney's letter arrived the following Monday, forwarded to Frances Alderton. It argued, in the elaborate confident prose of an attorney accustomed to winning difficult cases by filing aggressively and waiting for the opposing party to find the process too expensive to sustain, that the Foundry Lane collection should be considered an undisclosed marital asset subject to the terms of the family trust, given that it had been acquired during the marriage and maintained with family resources. Frances Alderton's response was 2 paragraphs. The first established, with documentation attached, that the warehouse deed had been in Mabel's name alone since 1981, predating the trust by 4 decades. The second noted that the trust document Derek's own attorney had drafted listed the covered assets by name, and the warehouse appeared on no such list. The failure of due diligence was Derek's. There was no legal basis for the claim. If it was pursued, Frances would be filing a response that included the complete timeline of the farmhouse sale and the full terms of the original trust negotiation, which she imagined would be of interest to the court. No further correspondence arrived from Derek's attorney. Jared called on a Saturday morning in late December, early enough that Mabel was still at the kitchen table with her first cup of tea. His voice was different from Derek's in register and in preparation. He said her name twice before he said anything else. He told her he had known from the beginning that something was wrong with what they were doing. He told her he had told himself that she would be cared for, that $1,200 a month was sufficient, that the farmhouse sale was probably for the best, and that he had known, at some level, that none of those things were fully true and had told himself them anyway because the alternative required standing up to Derek, and he had not done it. He said he was 28 years old and he was not offering that as an excuse. He said he was sorry in the specific, unornamented way of someone who is not asking to be forgiven and understands the difference. Mabel listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment. Some things take time to know what to do with, she said. I'll be in contact. She moved from the Maple Street apartment in February, into a 2-bedroom house on Elm Street 2 blocks from the First Methodist Church where she and Harold had married 53 years earlier. The backyard faced south and had been someone's vegetable garden once. She had a plan for it on graph paper within 2 days of moving in. The formal auction process for the collection's non-loaned pieces ran through the following autumn in a coordinated program managed by Meridian and Christie's under Frances Alderton's and Dr. Howell's oversight. The net proceeds, after fees and taxes, came to $11.4 million. The Harold and Mabel Corrigan Endowment for Mechanical Arts Preservation was funded at $3.5 million. Mabel kept the remainder, invested it with the same disciplined attention she had always brought to financial decisions, and did not make any of it into a spectacle. She was 78 years old, she was free, and she knew what money was for. The Württemberg Regulator was loaned to the Württemberg State Museum in Stuttgart pending full provenance documentation and permanent acquisition discussions. The Smithsonian received the writing automaton, the Tompion lawn case clock, and the Imperial Court clock on extended loan terms that Frances expected, based on the structure of the agreement, would become permanent within 5 years. In May, 6 months after the legal challenge from Derek's attorney had been dismissed without response, Mabel read a brief item in a Nashville business publication that Frances had forwarded without comment. Derek's real estate development company had entered financial difficulty following the collapse of a leveraged residential project on the eastern edge of Davidson County. The developer who had purchased a portion of the land, including the parcel that had once been the Corrigan farmhouse property, had declared bankruptcy before completing the development, leaving a dispute over commissions and a lawsuit that would take years to untangle. Derek had announced he was dissolving the company. Mabel read the item twice. She set it beside her tea. She was not glad about Derek's loss in the way that people sometimes permit themselves to be glad about the losses of those who wronged them. She felt something closer to the recognition of a pattern completing itself, the one where things built on what doesn't belong to you tend, over time, to develop structural failures that are not traceable to any single mistake but were always, in retrospect, inevitable. She set the item aside and went out to the garden. In October, the Smithsonian opened the Harold Corrigan collection in a dedicated display in the National Museum of American History's Science and Technology galleries. Mabel attended with Jared. He was 29 by then. Quieter than she remembered from his years at her Sunday dinners. Making a visible effort to be present without performing it, which she recognized as a form of seriousness she had not previously given him credit for. They walked the display together for an hour. The writing automaton had a case to itself near the center of the gallery, positioned under a light designed specifically to show the detail of the ivory carving without glare on the glass. A museum technician had wound and set it for the opening, and it was writing when they reached it, moving its pen across the paper in the slow, deliberate arcs required to form letters, encoding the sequence its makers had pressed into its 6,400 cams 200 years ago. They stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. The automaton wrote. It had no knowledge of what it was writing, or of who was watching it, or of the particular October afternoon it was operating within. It simply performed the sequence its mechanism required, one position at a time, with the consistency of something built correctly and maintained correctly and therefore given no reason to stop. Your grandfather, Mabel said, understood something most people don't take the time to learn. He understood that the things worth finding are almost never the things that are easy to see. Jared nodded. He was watching the automaton's hand move. She gave him Harold's first ledger before they parted, the one covering 1968 through 1979, beginning with the $30 carriage clock from the Knoxville estate sale. She told him she thought he should read it. He took it with both hands. She went back to Foundry Lane one final time the following week, on a November Thursday that was cold and clear and had not yet made up its mind about winter. The shelves were empty, the padded stands removed, the brass card holders still in place on the bare timber with nothing left to hold. Harold's workbench remained. She had asked the transport team to leave it, and they had. The small bracket clock Harold had been repairing when his health took him away from this place for the last time sat on the bench under the magnifying lens, exactly where he had left it. She had brought it to a specialist in Asheville in the spring, a man Dr. Howell had recommended, who had spent 8 hours completing what Harold had begun. It kept perfect time now. She had wound it that morning before driving to Foundry Lane. She set it under the work light. She switched the light on. The clock sat in its warm circle and ticked alone in the empty warehouse where dozens had ticked before it, marking the seconds of a November morning with the patient precision of something that had been built correctly and had therefore never had any reason to stop. She stood and listened to it for a while. Then she switched the light off, walked to the main entrance, and pulled the steel doors shut behind her. She did not use 3 padlocks. She used one small combination lock on the chain, set with 4 digits she did not need to write down to remember, and she tested it once, and it held. She drove back to Elm Street through the November streets of Hartley, past the First Methodist Church on the corner, past Crane and Hadley Hardware Supply where she had taken a job in 1969 and been paid honestly for the first time. She parked in front of the house on Elm Street and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The south-facing garden was waiting. The asters were still going. The garlic was in the ground, planted in the careful rows she had measured out on the graph paper plan in February and put into the earth in October, exactly when the calendar said to put them in. They would come up in the spring, as they always did, as everything she tended always did, because that was what happened when you showed up for something every day and gave it the attention it required. She got out of the car and went inside. Harold had known. For several months, with the particular certainty of an engineer who understood systems and their failure points, that something in his own system was beginning to fail. It was never dramatic. It was a slight uncertainty in his hands when he worked with the finest tools, a gap in his morning routine that had not been there the year before, a tendency to lose the thread of a calculation mid-thought and have to go back to the beginning. Individually dismissible. Together, unmistakable. He arrived at the warehouse on a Thursday in early March, the spring before his first stroke would give the decline a name and a direction. The morning was cold and clear in the way that clarifies rather than oppresses, and he unlocked the main entrance with the 3 padlocks in sequence and went inside and switched on the work light and stood for a moment, as he always did, letting the collection settle around him. He knew about Derek. He had known for several years, with the same certainty he knew most things through observation, patient and specific, accumulated across enough interactions to constitute something more reliable than instinct. He had watched how Derek's eyes moved through a room, registering, assessing, translating what he saw into what it might yield. He had watched how Derek asked about the investment accounts. How he performed concern about Mabel's well-being with a fluency that would have been convincing to anyone not paying close attention. Harold had always paid close attention. He sat at the workbench, opened the 9th ledger to a V-series entry he had been working on for 2 weeks, read what he had written, and added 2 sentences. He closed the ledger. Then he sat with his hands flat on the surface and thought about what he needed to do. The letter had been composing itself at the back of his mind for months. He had always believed in waiting for the right conditions before acting. He had also learned, across a long career of engineering problems that had not waited for him, that there was a meaningful difference between patience and postponement. He had been postponing this long enough. He took a sheet of ivory notepaper from the drawer below the bench. He did not plan what he would write. He simply wrote it, in the order things needed to be said, with the same precision he had applied to every document he had produced across 50 years of professional life, because precision was the most reliable thing he had to offer, and he understood, in the particular way of people facing a contracting horizon, that reliability was the form love took when sentiment was insufficient. He wrote for 3 hours. He set down the vault combination twice. He wrote Annette Howell's name and telephone number twice. He wrote what he knew about Derek, what he had done in response, and what he was sorry he had not managed to do differently. He wrote about the warehouse deed, registered in Mabel's name since 1981, a detail so embedded in practical routine that he had never framed it to her as what it actually was, a deliberate protection, maintained across 4 decades, because he had always understood that if something went wrong there needed to be something they could not reach. On the last page, he wrote what he had meant to say for a long time and had always found a reason to defer. He wrote it with the same precision he had used for everything else, because precision was the most honest form of tenderness he knew, and because he was running low on the one resource no solution could replenish. He folded the 4 pages along their natural creases, sealed them in a white envelope, and wrote her name on the front. Not her full name. Just, Mabel. He clipped the envelope to the clipboard above the workbench, behind the Meridian appraisal and the vault inventory, and hung the clipboard on its hook. Then he walked the perimeter of the warehouse one final time. He stopped in front of the writing automaton on the south wall and looked at it for a while, the poised hand, the waiting paper, the expression its Geneva makers had given it 200 years ago, the expression of someone who has something to say and is in the process of saying it as precisely as the mechanism allows. He had always considered that the finest thing about the piece. Not the complexity of the movement, not the provenance, but the expression. The look of a thing doing exactly what it was built to do, without hesitation, without awareness, without any need for recognition. He kept walking. He checked the vault door, confirmed it was seated, cleared the combination. He checked the climate control reading. He checked the side entrance padlock. At the main entrance, he paused with his hand on the light switch. The collection was behind him in the work light, 135 pieces, all of them running. He could hear them. The layered ticking he had spent 40 years assembling, each mechanism marking its own interval, and the cumulative effect of all of them together, something that had always been, for him, the closest thing to a proof that patience applied with enough consistency became something indistinguishable from permanence. He switched off the light. He stood in the dark and listened for a moment. The ticking continued. It would continue for as long as someone wound the mechanisms and maintained the conditions required to keep them running, which was all they had ever needed and all he was asking. He locked the 3 padlocks in sequence behind him, put the key ring in his coat pocket, and walked to his car in the cold March morning. He was already thinking about the authentication letters he still needed to write before the 9th ledger's final V-series entry would be complete. He was nothing if not thorough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.